welcome to the Mass Effect HYPEcast. I am your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this is a podcast about Mass Effect, the future of BioWare's premier franchise, and all of our speculation and ideas for the next game. Before we get started, subscribe to the Mass Effect HYPEcast on your favorite podcast app and leave a review on Spotify or iTunes. Or subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast, my other podcast, The Bonfire, as well as any videos I decide to make. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, check out the link in the description of the show. You can also support the show by sharing new episodes on any social media platforms you enjoy, or just share them with a friend. You can check out at Bon Diesel or at The Bonfire on Threads or Twitter if you want to share the post I make for the reveals of the show. Let's get into the podcast. It has been a few months. There just hasn't been much to talk about, so I've kind of been leaving it alone. I did intend on bringing in some guests, and I still may here in the next few months. I will likely actually be appearing on someone else's channel here in the near future. So, we'll let that conversation happen when it happens. But the three main things I wanted to talk about in this episode, kind of in the mid-year, mid-summer time frame, are my kind of thoughts on the next Mass Effect. After we've learned so much about Dragon Age The Veilguard. I actually did a video about this where I talked about three things. I kind of just want to speak more broadly about it and how I'm feeling in general. I want to talk about my kind of very early in 7-day predictions and what we may get this year, as well as kind of my current Mass Effect predictions and the best I can do when it comes to theories and just how I'm kind of feeling about the next game in general. So let's get into my thoughts about the next Mass Effect after learning about Dragon Age. So this has been interesting. Before, we had the, I believe it was the Xbox showcase where they showed a quick kind of cinematic or really more of a hype trailer for this game, which wasn't received very well if you paid attention to the discourse after that, which, isn't necessary. Maybe don't worry too much about that. But we got that teaser. And then a couple days later, they released I believe it was around the 15-minute gameplay reveal of Dragon Age The Veilguard. And then since then, for the last month, every couple days, there's been some kind of information dropped. So I believe it was Game Informer that had a pretty in-depth time with them where they were releasing a new article every few days, revealing pretty big chunks of info about this game. If you've been around my content or paid attention to this podcast or the other places I exist, you'll know that before this, I've kind of joked about how I felt like even though this game is coming out, this year in 2024, I've kind of joked that we've, knew more about the next Mass Effect, which is basically nothing, than we did this game. Now, obviously, that has changed very drastically in the last month, and we've learned a lot about the next BioWare game, Dragon Age The Veilguard. And I kind of just want to chat about that and how the things we've learned about that game, how they make me feel about the next Mass Effect and how I think that's going to impact it. What I will say, and I've been saying this for a while, the two things about the Veilguard is, one, I don't think things they're doing in this game we should expect to be one-to-one what they're going to do in the next Mass Effect. Dragon Age The Veilguard, which was previously Dreadwolf, which was previously, just Dragon Age 4, has gone through a lot. It's gone through, reportedly, multiple kind of iterations or reboots of the type of game it was going to be. At one point, it was rumored that it was going to be like a multiplayer game that was going to be maybe not quite an MMO, but definitely a more multiplayer based game where that was going to be more intricate to the way it was going to play. All the way to now, where this is a straight up single player game, which I believe they've even said can be played completely offline, requires, and I assume features zero multiplayer. So that's obviously changed a lot. One thing that's notable that I already forget a lot about is, the a good chunk of this game was developed, I imagine, during the worst parts of COVID. So I imagine it was in fairly early development when COVID started, which is probably the worst time. We saw games late in development when COVID started do fine. I believe it was like The Last of Us 2. There were various, especially Sony had a lot of games come out, during the beginning parts of COVID or shortly after, because they were probably in late stages of development, right? A game like Dreadwolf, which then became The Veilguard, probably wasn't so lucky. And then it seems like there's been kind of some weirdness with this game in the last year or so, where, there's been rumors for quite a while that this game has potentially been ready for quite a while. And either, maybe we'll never know, but was either given time to kind of wrap it up and maybe refine it and get it into a really, really good spot before it comes out, or maybe there were other issues that we're not aware of. But we do know things like Mark Dara, who left BioWare a while back, returned as a consultant and worked on the game for quite a while, and I believe is still consulting on the game. I imagine he'll be there through release. We also know that other studios under EA have been contributing their services to this game. The studio that's making the Iron Man game, of course I can't remember off the top of my head, but we saw multiple people from there in their LinkedIn profiles show that between, I think it was like 2022 and 2023, they were helping out with this game, and I assume getting some of the big chunky stuff done during development. We even found out that parts of the Mass Effect pre-production team had been brought over to help finish this game up. And however that impacts the Mass Effect game, which by all accounts is still extremely, extremely early in development and is definitely still in pre-production, isn't even being fully produced. So Dragon Age The Veilguard has gone through a lot, and I don't want to just assume that is what's going to happen with Mass Effect. It could. Maybe the next Mass Effect game is going to go through multiple iterations and multiple reboots, and heaven forbid there be another worldwide pandemic or like a world war or something. I try not to joke about such things because they seem not as unlikely as they may have at one point, but hopefully are still very unlikely. This is kind of what happened when Jeff Grubb around N7 Day 2023, did kind of a weird thing, in my opinion at least, where he kind of said, I've heard the next Mass Effect is extremely early in development, and then kind of said, and if I do the math like Dragon Age, then it won't be out until like 2030. I still to this day am a little annoyed that I felt like he kind of probably intentionally conflated those two things between what he had supposedly heard from a source and then what he thought, and he kind of massaged those together, and then a bunch of people came off and went nuts saying, oh my gosh, the next Mass Effect is 6 years away, or if not more. I don't think that's the case, and even if you kind of ignore some of the creativity he used when he talked about that, even if you take his exact words in place, where just saying the idea of the next Mass Effect is going to take 10 years to make because the Veilguard did. These games are in different situations. We now have a Mass Effect game that has been in pre-production probably since 2019 for 4 or 5 years. That's a very healthy amount of time. It likely kicked off pre-production when Casey Hudson came back to BioWare before he started Humanoid, and likely while he was setting up Humanoid Studio. We know that he came back for a year or two, and that my speculation has been for quite a while that he basically came back to help them get, lay down the groundwork, probably the long-term groundwork for what BioWare is going to do with Mass Effect, including this next game. It's been a couple years. I believe it was in 2022, maybe 2023. But it was 2022, I think. I kind of forget how long I've been doing this stuff now. Where they've had all of their directors in place for the next Mass Effect. That is not, I assume, something that happened with the Veilguard. And as far as I know, all of those people are still there. That's really good. What I'm getting at in this long, kind of long-winded talk is that I don't think that we should just assume that this next Mass Effect is going to take forever because the Veilguard did. The other point, I guess, is there's been a lot of talk about how the Veilguard is like the make or break game for BioWare. I truly don't believe it is. I truly believe that the Veilguard will probably go down as one of the most expensive games ever made, simply because of its length of development. Maybe that will show, maybe it won't from a quality point of view. But I hope, and this is probably too hopeful from me, I can certainly appreciate, that may be the take. But I would hope that the people at EA understand that the goal for Dragon Age is probably to break even. And that doesn't even mean I think it's not going to sell well. I think it'll sell great, especially if it's good. But it's more that this game was probably a very, very, its total cost after all these years is probably insane. Now, if they were able to start things over and develop the current game they're going to put out here in the next couple months, that game probably would have only taken 4 or 5 years to make, not this much, more extended time frame that this one's taken. But that's not the case. So I hope that there's a realization that, this game is going to struggle to make money, even if it does really well. And you would hope, and knowing EA and the moves they've made and the way they are, I understand skepticism here, that wouldn't be the end all be all, right? Now, I think that there is a case to be made that, the Veilguard needs to do well. And then there may be a make or break situation with the next Mass Effect. Like that could be, I still think that's probably the bigger fish to fry later on, where EA may even have an attitude of, hey, get the Veilguard out, let's make it as good as it can be. It's probably going to be great. But that next Mass Effect, that's the game where you kind of get to start from scratch and hopefully not deal with all these issues that you did with Dragon Age. And that's kind of where we're expecting things to really kind of tighten up, for the game not to take 7, 8, 9, 10 years to develop, for it not to be exorbitantly expensive, for it to have a good return when it comes to financials. I still suspect the onus is kind of on that game to do those things. There are things we've learned about Dragon Age, though, that I think are interesting. The art style is the first one. We know that the Dragon Age, the Veilguard, has what I would say is a realistic aesthetic, but definitely has a very slight, I don't even want to say cartoony, but definitely a stylized look to it. So if you compare the Veilguard to, say, Baldur's Gate, which has a very realistic, very grounded, photoreal, to a point, aesthetic, we're getting something a little more unique or a little more artistic from the Veilguard, and that's fine. Now, am I going to feel the same way with Mass Effect if they do the same thing? We'll see. I definitely expect a more realistic aesthetic with Mass Effect. I think one of the interesting things about the Dragon Age franchise, even though admittedly, ignorance alarm here, I'm pointing at myself. It seems like basically every single Dragon Age game has had pretty unique aesthetic, and that's partially because of the generations, that they came out in. That the first game and the second game I actually don't think were that far apart, and they look relatively similar. But then Inquisition has a pretty different look than those two games, and now the Veilguard looks like it's going to have an even more unique look than the other three. I think in a good way, personally. If you think about Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, pretty similar aesthetic. Obviously, the graphics got better through the series, but that was more of them probably learning Unreal and also making worlds, your environments smaller than the first game so they can have more detail. But overall, I think the aesthetic held pretty true. And for its faults and its strengths, Andromeda I still think carried on that trilogy aesthetic pretty down to the wire, to the point where obviously because of the initiative and kind of these some of these new folks involved, we did see some kind of new aesthetic and some new designs of ships and equipment and stuff like that. We also saw a ton of basically exactly the same designs on things from the trilogy. I think the most unique part of Andromeda was especially the human armor, but the armor in general, which is one of the things. Even though I don't love Andromeda, I think that the aesthetic and the design of the human armor, especially, is just really good. The Pathfinder armor looks great. The N7 armor looks really good, and then it's that C8 armor is just so good. Like, it just looks so awesome in Andromeda. So even though they did evolve that quite a bit, everything else still kind of fit. And all four of those games, I think when you look at them visually, feel very similar, at least more so than if you look at the 3 and now the 4 Dragon Age games. So that does lead me to hope that the next Mass Effect game maybe won't take this departure the way Dragon Age has. I wouldn't be surprised if, there's probably artistic and efficiency and, mechanical reasons they've decided to do this in Dragon Age. I don't think it's going to hurt anything. If anything, a more stylized art style probably works better in like a high fantasy type game where you have these extremely non-realistic, these kind of not grounded at all things happening like dragons and magic. So that's one place where I'd be okay if they kind of differentiate. We also found out that Dragon Age The Veilguard, we're going to have 2 companions. This was a big surprise to me. One, because Inquisition, you have 3. So the direct, previous game is different, as well as I was, and still am to a point, expecting the next Mass Effect game to have 3 companions plus our player character. If you look at all of the art from all of the teasers over the last 4 years for the next Mass Effect, all of it has featured, like in the 2020 trailer, there's Liara and then 3 NPCs in the background. In the 2021, that was the poster, I believe, there's 4 figures walking up and away from the ship in that poster. The 2022, I believe, shows something with 4 figures in it. The 2023 doesn't. We didn't get anything last year, at least from what I could tell, that was really indicating anything. But I've been speculating that we would end up with 3 companion characters in the next Mass Effect, and we could. But I will say that finding out that the Veilguard is actually knocking down the 2 is, at least some reason to believe that well, maybe this is a thing they're taking. They're going away from the Dragon Age roots and going, taking something from Mass Effect, or for development reasons or whatever, they decided 2 was going to be easier when you're recording banter and writing lines. I have to assume, and this is my, backseat or, recliner game dev opinion or thought, is that it's probably easier in general and faster to make a game where you have 2 companions compared to 3. I have to imagine that accounting for that third character, both in gameplay and visuals, and conversations and writing, all of that just takes more when you have more companions, right? So, maybe this was purely a development decision that, they wanted 3 companions to be like Inquisition, but they couldn't do it. And then we ended up where we are. We'll have to wait and see. I'm kind of indifferent on it. I think 2 companions is fine. More than anything, I really hope that we have more of a Mass Effect trilogy ability to control our companions, or at least the powers that they have, and like kind of ordering them, as opposed to like Andromeda, where you have very little control to basically none, from what I remember. And it looks like the Veilguard is kind of doing something in the middle where it doesn't look like we're going to have like direct control over like their movement and stuff, but that we will be able to have them use their skills and stuff, because there's a lot of coordination that you're going to be able to do between the skills of your character and your 2 companions, and so something more that way would be good. So that is something I hope the next Mass Effect takes from. A big one, and this is, I could probably spend the rest of the podcast talking about this, but the kind of hub and mission setup of the way that the Veilguard is going to work. If you think about the more, like in Mass Effect Andromeda, you have like kind of like a semi-open world game where you have these multiple pretty large areas on these different planets, where you discover side missions and complete main missions, and like you discover main missions within these open world areas, and so on. I believe, and I've played a little bit of Inquisition. I know that there's like different areas you can go in Inquisition, but that it's an open world game. And that's why you have, you have your mount that you can use in that game, and because you need to traverse large areas. That is not what's happening in the Veilguard. In the Veilguard, they've said there's no mounts. And I don't know if they've said or really confirmed that there's like no open world feeling places, but that it is going to be more of having hubs. We're going to have our home base in the Veilguard called the Tower. But we're also, we've seen cities and stuff. I have to imagine that we're going to have areas with like vendors and things like that. But it seems like it's going to be kind of that hub and mission style game, much like the original trilogy of Mass Effect, especially 2 and 3. Mass Effect 1, oddly enough, was probably the most open world of all 3 games. It certainly was. Even though it was still basically a hub and mission style game. If you think about like going to Novaria in Mass Effect 1, you have that hub area, and then that splits out into missions and mission areas. Same with Pharos. Still definitely kind of a hub and mission style. We're not talking about like an Ubisoft open world type game like Far Cry or something where you literally just look a direction and run that way and eventually find something to do. That's not what we're getting from the trilogy of Mass Effect, and not really even from Andromeda to a point. But the Veilguard is going to seemingly have this more structured kind of hub and mission style. There's been a lot of discussion, and including from me, about the next Mass Effect and whether or not they were going to do like a more semi-open world like Andromeda. It doesn't really work in a Mass Effect game to have one giant open world unless you're gonna keep the game on one planet, and then what are you doing with a Mass Effect game that takes place on one planet? No one wants that. Like, I'm sure you could do cool things with that, but no one really wants that. Maybe a spin-off game that's takes place during Mass Effect 3. It's the Earth Resistance game or something. Maybe that would work, but even then, that's not what we're looking at for this next entry into the series. It's really supported my idea that the next Mass Effect may not be as far away as people think if it's going to be a hub and mission style game. I think finding out that the Veilguard is that type of game doesn't directly mean Mass Effect will be as well, but there was that rumor a while back when Jess Gordon said that it may be more of a hub and mission style game. Then he came out and clarified that wasn't like a direct rumor from one of his sources or anything, but it was more so him saying, it's kind of like an industry rumor that's what's gonna happen. And when it comes to hoping that game, the next Mass Effect doesn't come out in 2028, 2029, 2030, hoping it does come out a little earlier. Even though, I definitely have the opinion of finish the game, obviously. Like, I don't want them to rush it out. I also don't want the game to take 10 years to make, right? If they are ditching even a like semi open world to go back to more of a Mass Effect 2 and 3 style game, that maybe isn't 100 hours long. Maybe it's 30 hours, like those games, like the trilogy games were. I'm down for that. That actually, I'm open worlded out. There's so many great open world games, and there's a bunch of bad ones too. If you want that, that can be satisfied. I'm cool if they don't do that with the next Mass Effect, and instead, all of the effort they would put into that, and you can argue without much return, because it often is tough to get a return from that. If they instead put that into romances and interaction and writing and dialogue and choices, and making the actual missions that we do fun, and side quests that we do fun, and giving us little secrets to find, and things like that, I would much rather have that than not have those things, or not have those things in a higher degree, to trade it off to have some open world to drive across for 20 minutes. So that's where I'm at. And again, I think that we could see a game come out in, maybe a 2026 or 27, if they aren't being expected to make, 10 planets that are, these giant open world spaces. So, maybe that's some copium, but I'm willing to go with it. We've also found out that, and that they've, devs on the Veilguard have been quoted that this is the most, romanceable, the deepest game they've done when it comes to romances and relationships and things like that. They've also made a really big point that not all relationships have to be romances in this game, that there is going to be a pretty big focus on the Veilguard having, friendships between your character and your companions, and even the possibility that if you snub or don't pursue a relationship with one of the companions, they may, or multiple companions, they may pursue with each other, which I think is kind of neat. We saw some of this with Mass Effect Andromeda. I really liked Andromeda because you had options. You didn't just have to romance everybody. You could be friends. Like, you could pursue friendship, like extreme friendship with like Jaal and things like that, as M or as a M character. The male protagonist, M Rider, and I like that it seems like they're continuing to pursue that with the Veilguard, and that gives me a ton of hope that we're going to see that from the next Mass Effect as well. I really loved the romances in Mass Effect, and Tali and Shepard's relationship, and that you can develop, is one of my favorite things in games. It's one of my favorite things to do. It's been a while since I've done a Mass Effect playthrough, actually, and as much as I want to see what it's like to do a romance with Shepard and other characters, even though I really like the romance between him and Miranda, or him and Ashley, or him and Liara especially, I always end up going with Tali because I just enjoy it. Even though I know exactly what's going to happen, and I know exactly how it's going to play out, and it's pretty simple to do, it's still one of my favorite things. So, I'm glad that that's obviously going to continue, and I hope in the Veilguard and the next Mass Effect, there's a little more nuance, there's a little more to it than just selecting the right dialogue at the right times. But also that ability to create, non-romantic relationships with your other characters, or not, to choose, that you don't have to do that. And then not to mention the potential for them to romance each other is really neat. We saw the faintest glimpse of that in the Mass Effect trilogy, where, if you don't romance Garrus or Tali, you have that moment at the very end of the game, right before you go back to Earth and wrap the game up. You can, if you go to, I believe it's Garrus's quarters, his the gun room, you can open up the door and they'll be embracing, and that, there's some allusion to them canoodling in some capacity. And while I don't know why that spiky, sharp weirdo is touching my wife, it's cool that they're taking that much further, and I think especially in a Mass Effect game, when we're going to be dealing likely with a crew on a ship and close quarters. I think it's cool that can be pursued or could be a thing. So that's definitely something that we're finding out from the Veilguard that I would really really love to see in the next Mass Effect. I already talked about I had no mounts on here, but we already talked about that in the kind of open world thing, and we already talked about the kind of combined skills and all of that. So the final thing that I think is interesting to take from what's going on with the Veilguard and how we're going to look forward to the next Mass Effect is the marketing. Like I said, to open this up, is it was kind of wild how little we knew about Dragon Age, even basically before the Xbox showcase. I would argue we knew more about Mass Effect, even though we know almost nothing about that game. We knew so little about Dragon Age, to the point where it came out that before, I think they probably wanted it to, that they changed its name. For the last couple of years, it's been known as Dreadwolf. That's obviously, I don't want to say obviously, because I don't really know it, but that's a reference to Solus, one of the characters from Inquisition, who's going to be playing what seems to be like a semi-antagonist in this game, but likely an ally at some point. And they said they changed the name because as the game developed, I bet at one point Solus was probably the main bad guy, and that was going to be a huge part of the story. And then I assume over the last few years, as they finished the game up, that it became something different, and they made different choices, which is great. That's fine. That's ideal. That means that they did something that they wanted instead of feeling like they had to do the thing they decided to do 4 or 5 years ago, probably, that they were willing to be flexible, which is really good for Dragon Age The Veilguard. That's really good for the next Mass Effect game, and that's really good for BioWare, because that means that they're being allowed to make big decisions. Like the fact that they were allowed to change the name of the game in probably less than 6 months before it comes out, that someone had to have been, whether it was Gary McKay or someone, had to be very convincing to get EA to do that, because that means they had to redo all of their marketing and logos and all of everything. They had to redo everything, and all of that name recognition from Dragon Age Dreadwolf that had built up over the last few years when they revealed that name, that was out the door, and now they had to start over again not long before it comes out. That gives me some hope that, one, EA is serious about supporting BioWare, because I think if they were on the fence about BioWare, they wouldn't have let them do that. And two, that there's a lot of bravery there and a lot of confidence from BioWare to do something like that, which I think is cool. I think that's a good thing. I think that should be something that we're that should bring confidence, at least in my opinion, to the player base. And then since they revealed Dragon Age The Veilguard, we've gotten this insane amount of info. The director of the next Mass Effect game he's just been going ham on Dragon Age stuff. He's really been teasing us like crazy, and he's been Mike Gamble has probably been he's probably revealed as much as anyone else has since the game was announced, and seeing that is cool. Because you can just, it starts to make you think like, man, if he's hyping up someone else's game this much, just think about when we start getting closer, or just when he can talk more about Mass Effect. I think it's likely, because this has been the trend for the last few years, that instead of announcing games 5 years before they come out and then slowly drip feeding info for years about them, and then they eventually come out, I think that's a very old school way of doing things. I think the next Mass Effect is one of the last games that is still part of that kind of generation. And I don't necessarily expect, because hopefully Mass Effect goes through less trials and tribulations than Dragon Age, I suspect we'll get more info about Mass Effect, earlier than we did with Dragon Age. But don't be surprised if we don't get if we don't get a lot of stuff until right before the next Mass Effect comes out. Because this is the way, at least currently, that they market these games. They kind of wait and they wait and they wait and they blitz the last few months or even weeks. In the case of a game like Hellblade: Senua's Saga, Hellblade 2, they blitz that game the last couple of weeks, and obviously, there's a lot of other reasons why that got blasted. I think that there's some console war stuff going on and stuff with that. But that was kind of strange, even though if you look at how games have been marketed for the last few years, that's kind of normal. That's kind of how things have been going for a while, especially with EA. EA's been on that really hard of only really marketing their games at the last minute, you could say. So if you're expecting after the Veilguard comes out and maybe Mass Effect isn't coming for 3 more years, if you think we're gonna get this like kind of drip feed of fairly substantial info over the next few years, I mean, maybe, N7 Day is unique, and they do seemingly like to give, relatively large amounts of info during that. And that will likely increase more and more as they actually make the game, which will probably start late this year, early next. But, just maybe look at what's going on with Dragon Age and temper your expectations a little for how much we'll hear about this next Mass Effect before it comes out. Now, speaking of N7 Day, let's jump into my early predictions on that. I think a really big factor on what we'll hear about the next Mass Effect is gonna really depend on if Dragon Age is out before it or not. We know that Dragon Age is it's currently slated for fall of 2024. We don't have an exact date yet. What you need to realize, at least here in the States, fall technically I believe begins in September and ends, I think, in December. So in theory, the Veilguard may not come out until December, and that would be after N7 Day on November 7th. Or it could come as early as mid-September or early October, and then that would be before N7 Day. If it comes out in September or even like October, there's a really good chance that by N7 Day, the vast majority of the big marketing pushes for Dragon Age are going to be over. They're going to be done. And that would really open up an opportunity for them to let Mass Effect really blow the doors open. I know people have said, and even I've said, don't expect too much. They haven't even begun full development yet on Mass Effect. Yes, that is true. But at the same time, they've been in pre-production for likely 3 to 4 years, if not more. So while they may not have whole worlds built out and full scenes and cinematics and everything ready to show, they probably know what it's going to be called, even though they may change their mind at the last minute. They probably do know all the characters, or at least all of them that are going to be in the game. Some could get cut, some could get modified. I wouldn't be surprised if, especially with their head, their director, their writing director being there for multiple years now, they probably know the story, the time frame it's going to be set in, or multiple potentially. The gist of what's going to happen, who's going to return from the trilogy or not, how, if people aren't coming back, how we're going to reference, the Shepard or Tally or Garrus, or these characters that if this game is taking place way after the trilogy, who are going to be dead. They aren't going to be around anymore. They probably have all that stuff figured out, at least to some degree. Obviously, things change when you start making the game and you make cuts and you make changes. And what I'm getting at is that while they may not have much to show at this N7 Day, I bet they're going to have a lot to tell. And I think if Dragon Age is out and the marketing for that game has kind of, peaked and is descending, it would be an opportunity for EA, for BioWare, for everyone to be like, okay, we did that. It's out. You guys loved it. Hopefully it does really well. Here's what's coming next. And we have more to talk about than you think we do. And that's when they can maybe reveal what the name of the game is going to be. Even though I even made a note in my notes here of maybe they won't do that because they may be gun shy to reveal a name now, even though they may have the story more set and stuff. But after changing the name of Dragon Age at the last minute, I feel like there may be a hesitation to reveal the name of Mass Effect, even though I bet they have it already. So we'll have to see. But, one of the things I've seen a lot of people talk about in my Discord and in my comments, my videos and stuff, is there's a lot of people who just They just want to know if Shepard's going to be back in the next game or not. They don't need details. They don't need to know exactly what it means if they won't be or will be. People, it seems like, and I can include myself to a point, I don't necessarily, and I say this now, say they do come out and say, yes, Shepard will be involved in the next game, or no, they will not. Well, then that just spawns 1,000 more questions, right? And so even though right now we may say, that's all I need to know, I can handle it if that's all I need, if that's all you tell me, then they would say that, and then we would want more, of course. But, that also plays to their hand, that they can kind of mess with us, right? Especially Gamble, who loves to do the tease. I think it really just depends on whether Dragon Age is out or not. If Dragon Age isn't coming out until late November or even December, they're probably going to temper what they're allowed to say for Mass Effect. And they could do that anyways, because really, they may want all of the attention to be on Dragon Age, even if it's already been out for a month or two by the time N7 Day happens. And I've been saying for a while, and I think even when I did my episodes with N7 Legend, and when I've just talked to people in general, I've still had it kind of on my calendar as 2025 more likely to be the first big blowout they have information wise. 2024 is likely still going to be a teaser to a point, for multiple reasons. It would distance themselves from Dragon Age, so they wouldn't be interfering with that and getting in the way of its hype. They would, will be a year into developing it, actually making the game, and that makes things a little easier to talk about. And that, if the game comes out in 26 or 27, it won't be that far from coming out, so they'll need to start their campaign to get people thinking about it, right? So I still do see 25 as way more likely to be the big blowout one, or, heaven forbid it be 26. But 24 this year's N7 Day, I think, could still have something substantial. And like I said before, it may not be as much show, a lot more tell, but there's a lot they could tell us that would create a lot of conversation and get a lot of hype. Something I've talked about with 2023, we got a trailer. It's 30 seconds, and it revealed nothing, really, other than showing us an N7 agent. But my big thing was I was able to do videos and do predictions and stuff on that 2022 N7 Day, despite the fact that it was mostly concept art, and then that the moving picture of that mass relay, supposedly, that's being built, with the Liara voiceover that people decoded. In theory, if you look at them side by side, you could argue that 2023's N7 Day gave us more than that, because it gave us a trailer, right? But really, from a content creator perspective at least, but as a fan and a speculator, 2022 gave us way more material to think about. And so even if 24 isn't going to be this big blowout of info, even if it means we don't get a trailer, which I bet we will in some capacity, maybe it's a continuation of last year's trailer, I hope that they're willing to show us kind of what they did in 22 of, giving us some concept art, showing us, just giving us some clues into what world we're going to be going into, what galaxy we'll be going into, or galaxies, as we've seen. So I don't want to overstate how much I think the next N7 Day could be. I think it's going to be pretty minimal no matter what. I think we'll get more if Dragon Age is out. I think we'll get less if it isn't. I think 25 is still going to be a bigger blowout year for info. But I really hope that they maybe kind of combine what they did with 22 and 23. If you want to give us that hype moment of showing us a trailer, don't make us wait multiple hours between 10-second segments, though. That was upsetting. That was annoying, is what it was. But, the trailer was still cool. It was nice to see. But give us some of that more simple stuff, too, that we got in 22. Even if it is just a voice log, even if it is a cryptic picture, but definitely concept art. I love concept art because it means nothing. It guarantees nothing. It could mean absolutely nothing for the next game, but there's always cool stuff to see. And it's just fun to kind of see where their minds are. Even if the scene that we see in the concept art never happens, if the characters in it never get seen again, it still kind of gives you a kind of idea of where they're at and where they're going, and that's fun to speculate on. So, as a fan and as a content creator. Now, that kind of rolls into my final topic of this episode of just talking about maybe just how I'm feeling about the next Mass Effect in general at this point, after we've heard about the Veilguard, after I've thought about its implications for the next game, after we've seen some of the kind of topsy-turvy stuff going on with BioWare and EA, the games industry in general, what's going on with like the console platforms and all of that. To talk about it in a really simple way, think about the story and what they may do with the next game. I am at the lowest point I've ever been with the next Mass Effect on whether or not I think we're going to see Shepard, or especially be Shepard again. I know this is a big division in the community. I want to play a Shepard. I want one more go at it. I think the things we saw, especially in 23, for that to happen, the next game would likely have to take place after Mass Effect 3 relatively shortly. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's what we're getting at this point. So I'm at a point now where I still want to play a Shepard in one more game. I understand why some people don't, but I'm definitely getting to the point now where I've been like preparing my brain to find out that that's not what's going to happen. And that's fine. I can think of all kinds of ways they can introduce a new protagonist, and it could be really, really great. No problems with that. There's definitely things I don't want. I don't want to play as Shepard's kid. I don't want to play as a frozen Shepard. The funny thing for me is that even though I want Shepard to come back, the ways that I'm okay with Shepard coming back are so narrow, where I don't want a clone. I don't want his kid, like I said before. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I don't want time travel. I don't want him to get cryo frozen and brought back later. I don't want any of that. I either want to play a Shepard shortly after 3, or I want to see a lot of really cool homages to Shepard, whether it's stories from a still living Liara, whether it's going to human planets or planets in general during the course of the game and seeing like Shepard statues and these exaggerated stories about how they saved, the galaxy or the universe. And to kind of, hear maybe stories from Liara or others about things that Shepard did after the events of the last game, maybe based on choices we made that we get to introduce into the next game. I would almost rather get really awesome fan service and callbacks to Shepard than some weird implementation that feels forced and unnecessary. So I'm struggling with that a little bit, because before last year's in 7-Day, I had this idea of like the perfect Mass Effect game. And with what we saw last year, or at least what was implied, there's like zero chance my idea is going to happen. Not that they have to take my idea. I'm an idiot. There's a reason I'm talking about this game instead of helping them make it, right? But yeah, I've definitely tried to kind of do some like preemptive like copium or preparation for my heart to realize that this thing I was really hoping for as a newer Mass Effect fan who wants more from Shepard, it's probably not going to happen, and that's fine. There's lots of ways it can be handled that are still really cool. I have more and more started to buy into the idea of like, man, like they're probably going to do multiple timelines or some kind of like wormhole stuff or whatever, like when we saw that art from last year's N7 Day that's on that poster in the middle of the N7 agent, that you see that bar scene where we're seeing species in the same bar that, from what we've seen so far from Mass Effect, shouldn't exist. We see Geth with Angaran. There's no reason for that to be happening. Maybe a Geth stowed away on one of the Nexus ships, Nexus, or one of the other arcs. But then we also see species that we know never made it to Andromeda, whether they weren't sent on that mission at all, or because they were on the Quarian arc that never made it. Now you could explain maybe that Quarian arc eventually did make it, and this next game is going to take place in Andromeda, and even though there's every other teaser implied it's Milky Way, who knows? Things change maybe, or maybe it's both. We'll have to wait and see. I'm thinking that we're almost certainly going to get some kind of dual galaxy situation, which really lends to the ideas of the game being set way after the trilogy and things like that. And we might get multiple timeline stuff. I don't want that. The only multiple timeline thing I would really want to maybe see is if the prologue was used as a way for people like me who want that last experience with Shepard. And maybe the prologue is 30 minutes to an hour of showing us the game, showing us new mechanics, introducing us to the game from a mechanical point of view, while also giving us that final closure of this is what happened after Mass Effect 3, maybe based on choices you made, maybe not, maybe they're going to set canon. We'll have to wait and see. Here's what Shepard's been up to. You can maybe design your Shepard to look like what you wanted from the trilogy or the base one, like I always use. And then and here's what's starting to happen. And we fade, we jump into the future. We leave behind that Shepard and the actual game begins. And we take over a fresh N7 recruit, or we take over a bounty hunter, or whoever we're going to play as in this next game. Then we move into that, hundreds of years later. And that's how we see, we see an elder Liara. We see a very, very, elder, I don't know, Grunt, or, man, maybe still Rex, if he's still kicking around somewhere. That's like the one kind of time jump thing I think I could be cool with. If they give us an opportunity to have that one last moment with everyone at the beginning of the game is like the biggest fan service ever. And then they say, okay, we gave it to you. Now let's move on to the actual game. And then we go from there. So that's my hope. If they do, my biggest issue really with them doing like a multi-galaxy or like part of the story, we play partly in Andromeda or partly in the Milky Way or partly in the future and partly in the past or whatever, is that just requires so much work. And when I've already talked about how, them doing this hub and mission style game would probably decrease the length of time this next game will take. Well, the advantages of all of that get erased immediately if you do these two different galaxies and stuff like that. Maybe, I mean, I'm not a game dev. Maybe it wouldn't really be that difficult. Or maybe, with UE5 tech that they're going to be using in all of this, maybe it becomes easier with some of the tech that they've come up with. I don't know. But I guess what it comes down to with the next game is I've really just kind of thrown away most of my expectations, and I'm just kind of going for the ride. I'm hoping that Dragon Age The Veilguard does great and gets good review scores and it sells really well, and BioWare is in the good graces of EA, and then that team, the majority of that team, I'm sure that The Veilguard will get some DLC, so they'll keep some people on that project or even use other studios to do that. But I would say by the end of this year, they're going to start transitioning the bulk of their team over to Mike Gamble's team to start making the next Mass Effect. All of this frameworking he and his directors and everyone else in that pre-production team have been working on for the last 2, 3, 4 years will start to get filled in. All of that framework, all of those, all the bones that they've been putting together all this time will start getting filled in when they flood that team with all of these developers coming off of the Veilguard, right? And that's exciting. That's exciting as a fan of Mass Effect, who wants BioWare to have their big comeback, who hopes the Veilguard is great, who hopes it that propels them into the next Mass Effect. And what I will say is that seems like it's good. Is this next Mass Effect? One thing I've thought about with it as we start to wrap up the show, there's a decent chance it's a next gen game. There's a lot of rumors that the next Xbox may be coming as soon as 2026, likely with the PlayStation 6 coming shortly after that. And while there is some kind of weirdness with where Xbox is going with hardware and their whole deal, and even PlayStation to a point that they may have to make some big changes in the way that they do things, it still seems very likely that we're getting at least one more gen of hardware, right? And so, it's very likely this game will be one of those. Will be a next gen game potentially. And then not to mention that, man, the Switch 2 or whatever the next Nintendo thing is, maybe with DLSS we'll finally get a Mass Effect game on that. Even though I can't remember if the Legendary Edition is on the Switch or not. I can't imagine it is, but you can let me know in the comments if you're on YouTube or on Spotify. Actually, you can leave comments on Spotify now. So overall, I think the way that they've handled Dragon Age so far gives me a lot of hope that BioWare is on the right track. It gives me a lot of hope that EA seems to be fully behind them, like genuinely, by some of the things they've been allowed to do and the way they're marketing this next game. And it gives me a lot of hope that as long as the Veilguard isn't like a complete catastrophe, which I don't think it will be, and in fact I think it's going to do pretty well from the kind of vibes around it right now, it gives me a lot of hope that not only is the next Mass Effect definitely happening, which I think is basically guaranteed anyways, but that it's probably going to be in a good spot to really get full support and to really do and get to do everything they wanted to. So that's where I'm going to start to wrap up this one. I hope that I don't go another 6 months without recording an episode. I know we won't, because I imagine by October I will do some kind of big like prediction episode for N7 Day. That would be one where I would love to have N7 Legend on, or someone, if someone else wants to jump on, or multiple people. We can maybe do kind of like a panel and talk about what we are expecting to see from that. So that's only a couple months away, as hard as it is to believe. If there's any big, I don't want to say leaks. I don't really want to cover leaks necessarily, but if we get any info dumps, or if anything happens that is directly Mass Effect related, I very well could record another episode before then. But yeah, that's where we're going to be going. So I will say, as I wrap things up here, if you want more like week to week or month to month news, or if there's a small tidbit that isn't necessarily needing a whole Mass Effect podcast, you can catch my other podcast, The Bonfire, which I do a weekly show where I talk about all gaming news, but I definitely talk about BioWare or Mass Effect if there's any reason to. Basically, be sure to check that out. That's on all podcast platforms and on my YouTube, as well as my YouTube channel in general, where I do post a lot of videos, a lot of speculation about Mass Effect, and my Twitch channel. All of these under Bon Diesel. If you want to see me when I am occasionally online, that should pick up a lot in August as my schedule opens up a bit. But I'm gonna wrap this thing up. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please consider supporting all of my content by watching, listening, sharing, and following my socials, or throwing a few bucks my way via the link in the show description. If you have your own topics, questions, or feedback, be sure to let me know in my Discord, which is in the link in the description, in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on Twitter or Threads as Bon Diesel, or on The Bonfire. That is all I have for this episode of the Mass Effect HYPEcast. So until next time.